everybody. My name is Daniel Rothenberg. I'm co-director of the Future Security Initiative, which, as many of you know, it's a partnership between Arizona State University and New America, a DC-based think tank, and we engage security issues, but from a very interdisciplinary manner, where we really conceptualize security as human flourishing. So, some of our events deal with classic security questions like war and military issues, but others deal with broader issues. Particularly, we're really thrilled tonight to have our an ASU Future Security Fellow at New America, which is a special group of annually selected New America Fellows, very competitive fellowship, and we support several of them. Marielena Incapié is with us tonight, who's part of the 2026 class of fellows, a couple of other speakers. We have 4 this year that are ASU Future Security Fellows. But we're really thrilled to have Marielena with us. She's going to be talking about migration, U.S. migration policy, and discussing, some insights that are associated with her upcoming book, which is called Becoming America: A Personal History of Our Nation's Immigration Wars. So Marielena is a nationally recognized immigrant justice leader, strategist, and democracy advocate. She was for years the executive director of the National Immigration Law Center and played a key role in supporting immigrant youth in defending the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, the DACA program. Everyone in Arizona is pretty familiar with that, particularly as it links to university policies, ASU, and other state universities. And also working on U.S. citizens and their undocumented spouses and achieving the recent Keeping Families Together policy. She co-founded the Protecting Immigrant Families Coalition to expand the access to safety net programs, and she's currently a visiting legal scholar at Cornell Law School. I was recently named Northeastern Law's Judith Owens Brown Forum for Women in Law as a practitioner in residence. So thank you so much, Marielena. We're really thrilled to have you here with us. We will follow the usual system here, which is we'll chat for a little bit and then we'll open everything up for Q&A. And to ask a question, just drop it into the Q&A box in Zoom. I'm sure you're all familiar. So thank you so much. We're just pleased to have you with us. And maybe you could just give us a little bit of an update of what your book is about and how you decided to write a book with that compelling title.
Great. Thank you so much, Daniel. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be in this conversation with you. And of course, grateful for the opportunity to be an ASU Security Fellow at New America. So the idea for this book was born during the first Trump administration, when I started asking myself whether my low-income immigrant working class family would be welcomed if we were trying to migrate to the United States at that time. We came when I was 3 years old in the 1970s. My father was a textile worker that was recruited to Rhode Island to work in the textile factories, and the immigration laws were very, very different, right? On the heels of the civil rights movement of the 1965 Immigration Act, my father and many, many other people were able to come, and he was considered a skilled worker that came on a labor contract, but it provided a green card. And so that allowed for him to petition for my mother and my 9 brothers and sisters and myself. And so during the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, I really started becoming increasingly concerned, not just from a immigration policy and law perspective, but really about what it meant for who we were becoming as a country. And, as someone who has spent the last 3 decades working at this intersection of economic justice and racial justice and immigrant justice, I found myself asking these deeper questions about what were the laws and policies and conditions that allowed for my family to get here? And perhaps more importantly, what did this moment reveal about who we were becoming as a country? And so as I started writing the book, I started writing because I felt that for many years that we had been telling the wrong story in the United States, right? Telling the wrong story about immigration, or at least an incomplete story. And I say that because immigration is often framed as a policy problem that needs to be fixed, needs to be solved, or a crisis that's out of control and needs to be managed. But what I've come to understand throughout my work and in my own life is that immigration is actually one of the clearest ways, it's the clearest lens of what the health of our democracy is. And so the book weaves together my own personal journey with the broader historical narrative of the United States from the first immigrants who arrived on this country that we now call the United States, all the way to the present day. And one of the central arguments in the book is that immigration has always functioned as both a mirror and a wedge, a mirror reflecting our deepest values as a nation and the contradictions, but also a wedge that has been used, and we're seeing that more and more recently, really immigration being used to divide, to destabilize, and to undermine our democracy. And the last thing that I'll say is that writing a book that was not just a policy book, but instead a narrative nonfiction that really tells the story of the country's immigration history through a family saga was very important to me because, again, one of the things that I saw during the first Trump administration was the power of narrative, the power of telling stories and selective stories about who immigrants are or who they are not. Has been used very effectively during the first Trump administration, and we're seeing once again how that is being used. And so, in my family's experience, because I'm the youngest of 10 children, I'm in the book. I'm not writing only about our experience as immigrants from Colombia, but I've selected several couples, several in-laws. And so one of my brother-in-laws, for example, his ancestors go back all the way to the Mayflower. And he didn't even know that when I started the research on the book. And I have a sister-in-law whose grandparents came from Russia and Poland in the late 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, that has allowed me to go back to that period of history, immigration history as well. So that's in general kind of what the book is about and what the legal and historical research that I've been working on is.
So when you were growing up as an immigrant, what was sort of the narrative that you felt you were quite young? What was the narrative about America and migration that you felt as a child?
Yeah. So, the first thing I think it's a great question because I think the big difference is because I came with a green card, and all of my siblings did, right? We were permanent residents. What was the most defining, I think, identity for me was being of a working class family, right? And knowing that sometimes my parents were laid off from their factory jobs, and we then had to sometimes be on food stamps or rely on unemployment benefits. And there were all these public policies that actually allowed our family to have economic security, that allowed us to be on a path out of poverty. My parents were very clear. They didn't have any formal education. My father had a second grade education and my mother a fifth grade education, but they were clear that they had sacrificed so much to come to this country so that we would have a better life and an education. And so they were clear that we had to get a higher education, go to college. And part of the narrative that at least my family and our experience in Rhode Island was that my father was very clear that we had come to this country and it was our responsibility to leave it better off than we had found it. And that we had been welcomed into this country by the immigration laws that allowed him to bring us. We left at a time that the Civil War was just starting in Colombia. And so they knew that raising 10 kids in Colombia when my older brothers might be conscripted into the military, where we would not have access to a higher education, coming to the United States opened the door for my family to thrive and for my parents to be able to fulfill their dreams.
But that really sounds like this classic nation of immigrants, melting pot vision that's largely positive, where immigrants come to the country, realize dreams that were previously not possible in their home country. It seems like such a strong, profoundly American story. So, what happened to that story?
Well, I think part of, and this is part of the book, is also understanding the reason that the title talks about immigration, the nation's immigration wars, is immigration laws, when we widen the lens and we look at immigration in my family, not just my immediate family, but also my in-laws and their ancestors, we see how throughout history, the history of the country, starting all the way from the Mayflower, immigration laws or the lack thereof also have been used to either provide opportunities or to restrict. And we saw that I've had family members who were not able to become naturalized citizens, family members who were deported, family members, for example, my sister-in-law's grandmother from Poland came just before the 1924 Immigration Act passed, and she never got to see her family ever again. She came when she was 15 years old, just similar to what my older sisters came when they were at about 15, or one of them was. And so part of the immigration story that I'm trying to tell, again, is not just my immediate family, but throughout the history of our extended family, how immigration either brought us together, allowed for families to be reunited, or separated families as well.
And you've written quite a bit about the core relationship, not only in the US, but around the world and conceptually, between immigration policy, immigration narratives, and democracy, with a strong idea that, that the way in which a nation manages its immigration and its conception of immigration is key to a thriving democracy.
Yeah, and that's been a more, I would say, more recent realization, Daniel, to be completely candid, right? I think for most of my life, I worked on really fighting for the rights of immigrants, of low-income immigrants, particularly for the 22 years that I was at the National Immigration Law Center. And most of the work was really looking at how immigration law and policy, or other policies that impacted immigrants, like labor laws, access to healthcare and safety net, education, right? How we could expand the rights of immigrants to have the same opportunities that my family had, or how did we challenge laws that restricted immigrants from being able to thrive? And I think about, and perhaps we can talk about that in a bit, about Arizona's SB 1070 and the impact that that had on local communities, not just immigrants, but also others. And so for most of my career, I've really focused much more on the immigrant justice lens. And since leaving the National Immigration Law Center and being able to have the spaciousness and take a step back, and particularly in this current climate, it's so clear to me now that immigration really has been not only central to the narrative of the nation, but it actually has shaped who we are as a nation, right? At every single pivot point historically, immigration has either been used to expand who is considered worthy of belonging in this country, or to restrict and exclude people, oftentimes because of race, as we saw, for example, in the 1800s. It was as Irish immigrants started coming in large numbers, many of them were Catholics. And so there was an anti-Catholic narrative that then aimed to exclude Irish people. Very similar arguments, right? They're stealing our jobs, they're committing crimes. Then fast forward, and you have Chinese immigration, especially to California and in the West Coast. And because of who was coming was changing, there were efforts to exclude them. And so, we can go on and on throughout history. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to do in the book, is showing those key pivot points throughout our history where immigration has actually been intertwined with democracy. And then today, it is clearer than ever how immigration is being used to undermine democracy. And not just in the United States, we're seeing that globally as well. And what I would just say at the global level, because I think this has been particularly a resurgence in the last decade of what's called the Great Replacement theory, really looking at this argument that Black and brown migrants and refugees are coming to take our jobs, to commit crimes, doing all of these things. And that argument and that authoritarians are using is really being used to scapegoat migrants and to exploit the economic pain that a lot of people feel in their countries, including in the United States, and to exploit the anxieties, cultural anxieties that people feel about their neighborhoods changing, languages changing, who is coming or who is leaving. But again, it's being used very strategically and very intentionally to divide communities, to divide countries, and to undermine democracy and put in place fascist or authoritarian regimes. And we've seen that throughout the world in the last decade, especially.
When did you see, maybe you could talk a little bit more about the Great Replacement theory, but also, you've worked for so long on immigrant justice issues. When did you see that idea, which probably has been floating around for many years, but when did you see it, becoming, informing policy and becoming so salient, in real immigration debates?
So I think that the first time, well, again, it's been an ebb and flow. It's been really part of our history throughout the entirety of this nation's history, and I would say not just the 250 years that we're celebrating today, but actually even from the beginning, from when the first immigrants came on the Mayflower and subsequent boats. So again, there's always been this. Kind of rhythm throughout history where we see those ebbs and flows. But I think that the two times that I would think of, one historical and one current, that would point to, Daniel, in response to that question is in early 1900s, 1924, that led up to the 1924 Immigration Act. So you referenced earlier the melting pot, right? So the melting pot was a framework that was used, and there was a play that talked about immigrants are coming from all different parts of Europe, and they're coming together and are being melded into this new identity of American. And that was to celebrate the diversity, and that was part of Americanization campaigns and all these different changes. That was at a time when the United States was experiencing the highest levels of migration between 1890 and 1920. Now, there was an opposite perspective and worldview, which was the eugenicists, right? The eugenicists really believed that only certain Europeans were worthy of being here, and that's when they coined it the Nordic race, and they were looking specifically at people from northwestern Europe, and everyone else was considered inferior, including people from Poland and Russia. And it was that white supremacy, white superiority that led to the creation of the 1924 Immigration Act that pretty much tried to close immigration down for about 4 decades of the United States history. And in that 4 decade, we saw families being separated. We saw the humanitarian cruelty of turning Jewish people away, people who were trying to seek safety, security from the Nazis were turned away because of those national origin and racial quotas that were in place, but also because of the public charge rules that were put in place. And the public charge rule dates back to 1882 from the time of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And now we're seeing that again. When you look at the language, the narrative that was used in the legislative history leading up to the 1924 Act, Daniel, you can literally replace today's politicians, the names for the legislators of that period of time. It's the same exact language, right? It's they're coming to commit crimes, they are murderers, they are rapists, they are stealing jobs. The countries are emptying their insane asylums and their prisons. They're poisoning the blood of our country. All of that language comes from that period. And so fast forward 100 years later, that's what we're seeing with the current administration, with the Trump administration using that language. And again, we see that being used by other authoritarian regimes around the world. Particularly, I'm thinking of Viktor Orban in Hungary, who really started using that in about 2015 in response to the refugee crisis. And you see a lot of narratives being shared, resources and strategies being shared across the borders by authoritarian actors that believe in the Great Replacement theory. And that has had dire impacts in the United States. In El Paso, Texas, we saw how someone went in and massacred Latinos in outside of, I think, at a Walmart, and that was in part very much because of the Great Replacement theory. And there have been a number of those democratic terrorism that has happened in recent years as a result of that Great Replacement theory.
Could you give a little overview of what the Great Replacement theory is, how it operates? What's the claim?
Yeah, so the claim is that Black and brown people and Jewish people are organizing to take over to replace the white race, and that as a result of large-scale immigration, the white race is going to disappear or is at risk of disappearing. And that is exactly the same language that was used before the 1924 Immigration Act by the eugenicists. In fact, one of the characters in my book is Madison Grant, who wrote the book, The Passing of the Great Race. And the argument then was that liberal immigration or people who were pro-democracy were too soft and were allowing for the suicide of the white race. And so this comes very much from this place of white supremacy. And what's interesting though, Daniel, again, if you take the historical perspective, is the construct, social construct of race has changed over time. So again, in the 1920s, this was the Nordic race, right? Northwestern Europeans trying to exclude Italians and Irish and Polish and Russian, who today we would think of as white, who themselves probably identify as white, but back then they were considered inferior. Same thing in terms of trying to block Asian migrants altogether. Today, we see this not just with attacks against Latinos, who are a large percentage of today's immigrants in the United States, but also African, right? We've heard the Trump administration talk about the shithole countries or people from Asia, et cetera. So that backlash against immigration is now being spread to almost every other nation and nationality, but that great replacement has that same it's the same roots in eugenesis, which is about the replacement of the white race.
Do you take some solace, though, in the idea that understanding Irish people or Catholic Germans or any of these groups, or say Italians, these various groups that at different periods in US history were viewed as threatening to white people, that it almost seems absurd. It's almost hard to imagine in
Yeah.
an era of, say, St. Patty's Day parades or pizza parlors all over, all of these things that were so profoundly, they come out of an immigrant experience and they're viewed as widely American. Do you take solace in the fact that those groups it's almost impossible to imagine somebody looking at those groups of people and seeing them as not part of this group that is called white people? Doesn't that suggest that there's a malleability and that malleability, may have a very positive outcome?
Absolutely. And I would say a couple of things about that. One is, in part, that's the impetus behind my book, right? By going back and talking not just about my Colombian migration or our Latino family, but instead going back and connecting the dots between our very diverse family that is representative of a microcosm of America. I want readers to see themselves in my family story and to be reminded about their own immigrant roots. Because I think part of my hypothesis, Daniel, is that a lot of people have lost touch with their immigrant roots. They don't know when their ancestors came or why they came or what were the laws at the time that they came. I often hear this piece of like, oh, but our ancestors came the right way. Well, as I went back and looked at my brother-in-law Michael's ancestors who came on the Mayflower, guess what? That is the only period of time that we've had true open borders in this country. They didn't need passports, they didn't need visas. There were no immigration laws, and that was the case actually for almost 250 years until, after the American Revolution, and then immigration laws later on until the late 1800s, really. But I think the other thing that gives me, so I think solace in the sense that there are changes that happen over time. I think one of the things that's hard about this moment is the backlash is so severe against all immigrants, against both not just undocumented immigrants, because that's often the narrative is about quote unquote illegal immigration or unlawful immigration, but actually we're seeing people's status being taken away, right? People who are Americans at heart, with the exception that Congress has failed to act. Congress has failed to act for 40 years. I was in high school the last time Congress reformed immigration laws. And so part of what gives me solace is that in this moment, when the backlash is so great and the anti-immigrant not just the rhetoric, but the policies are impacting so many parts of our society. And US citizens are also being impacted by the policies and the police state that's being created, that many more people will come together to fight for all of us, not just for immigrants, but that this is really a fight of what I call the project of us, that it's time that we really look at how do we fight for all of us, Americans and Americans in waiting.
Do you see past historical corollaries of this level of police action, militarized roundups? Obviously surveillance was different in the past, but is there some way where you can look back at prior situations and then maybe learn some lessons from what happened and maybe some paths forward?
Yeah, so that's part of the research that I'm doing. I think the period of time, again, the early 1900s, I'm thinking of the Palmer raids in particular, where there were roundups happening. And what's interesting is that the surveillance at that time and the kind of who was considered to be a threat were people that were joining unions, right? Quote unquote anarchists, people that might be communists. We also saw that in the 1950s with the McCarthy era. So again, we see moments in history where we've been through periods like that, and it we have gotten through them. And so I think one of the things that I know is often hard for people in this moment because it feels so overwhelming when there's so many attacks on different parts of our society, not just on immigrants, is that this too shall pass. Like I am confident we will get through this period of time. And but it will take all of us to fight for a country that we want to become that really is inclusive, radically inclusive of all of us.
Do you find is there a discourse or a narrative that you're developing that is inclusive in this way and focuses on us and focuses on a broad understanding of Americans, and yet does not use the terms that are so, kind of attacked these days or intense diversity, um, particularly diversity, right? Is there a different language that you know tells this immigrant story, recognizes these varied backgrounds, but maybe avoids a sort of language that has become, that proves divisive for so many people?
Yeah, I think for me, what I've been circulating around in my mind is, what I'm calling the project of us, right? That we don't have the luxury to fight for one community or one group of people, that we're at a moment in our history where the seams of our fabric are about to rip apart. And that until we all recognize that immigration actually is very intentionally being used to divide us, that there's an opportunity for us to actually come together, right? That immigration can be what helps us reunite and see and recognize our shared histories as well as our shared futures. That the project of us has to be all of us, right? That all means all. And one of the things that I've been talking to, especially when I talk to young people, is really encouraging us in this moment where everything does feel so consequential and divisive and polarized, that we need to be having courageous conversations. That in this moment where people in families have stopped talking to each other, people have lost friends over whether you voted this way or didn't vote, that it's actually the moment for us to be coming closer together with people that may think differently from us, and starting with the people who are closest to us, right? Whom we may not feel we're either avoiding altogether and not talking to them anymore, or we're avoiding certain topics when we're with them. And instead, that we approach these conversations and these people from a place not of judgment, but from a place of curiosity and learning and wanting to understand, like, hey, what were you thinking of? What were you reading? What were your concerns when you voted or didn't vote? And how are you feeling now? What's happening? And I will tell you, Daniel, that I've had many, many conversations like this. And when I sit with people, particularly young people, both in my family and in my kind of just broader circles, it's been very powerful for me to hear from people, and sad at the same time, but I'm glad that I'm doing it, where people say to me, you know what? I had not felt safe anywhere having this conversation. I didn't even know where I could ask these questions, like basic questions that people are just trying to make sense of this moment. People are trying to make sense of the world that we're in and how do we move forward. There's a lot of shame that I'm finding, that people feel ashamed of haven't felt a certain way or done a certain thing or not voted or voted a certain way. And again, if we really see this as an opportunity for us to come together and really see our own humanity and take the politics out of it, but see that at the end of the day, as human beings, we all have the same needs. We need to belong. We need to feel safe. We want to feel the ability to thrive and we have our basic resources met, and that we have the same fears, right? The same fears and similar dreams of wanting our children, nieces and nephews, people in our families, future generations to have a better life than ours did. And that is at the core what immigrants throughout our history have been. The same people, the same ancestors, my brother-in-law Mike's ancestors who came on the Mayflower, they did not come for religious persecution or religious freedom. They came for economic freedom. They were not one of the people fleeing the Netherlands and then in England because of religious persecution. They were coming for economic reasons, the same reason my parents did, the same reason millions of immigrants around the world do today. And so trying to find those moments where we can come together and see our humanity in each other and taking the politics out of it, but really with a commitment that this is about all of us, that it's only when we come together can we really make it through this period, and not only make it, but actually help build the new country that we want to, that America wants to finally become.
It also seems that I don't know how this plays out, but we're a country that at least one of the narratives is that it is fundamentally a nation of immigrants. Unlike, say, you mentioned Viktor Orban. Hungary is a country with a sort of obscure language, is spoken by most of the people. That's hard to learn. That has a very particular culture. It's surrounded by countries that are different in various ways, culturally, otherwise, even though it's part of a larger Europe, you know, but its fundamental identity is particular to Hungary and Hungarians. It
Hmm.
does seem like one of the stories, one of the elements that makes the US maybe exceptional and certainly core to its identity is a nation of immigrants idea. And is that something that the country has lost for political reasons? And if, yeah.
Yeah, no, so I was going to say absolutely. I think the point you're making about the United States being unique in that sense is absolutely right. I mean, this is part of the experiment, and it's still a very young experiment when we compare it to other democracies in other countries. The United States, the land, right, that we call the United States was land that was being stewarded by indigenous people throughout the Americas. And it wasn't until immigrants arrived, right? And I think, again, we often talk about the pilgrims and we talk about like there's, these different narratives and founding stories of our nation. But without immigrants, this country would not exist as it currently exists. And that is true both in terms of indigenous people, but also enslaved Africans, right? Like the labor to the beginnings of this nation was about forced migration. So the voluntary migrants who came on the Mayflower and subsequent votes from Europe, but also the migration, displacement of peoples, and then internal migration, right? We've had a lot of internal migration. So, whether again, forced migration of indigenous peoples from the westbound pioneers, or even the great migration of blacks leaving the Jim Crow era, migrating to the north. So migration is in our DNA. It's who we are as a nation, and we can't get away from that. What's interesting is that the framework of a nation of immigrants is actually relatively new. That's only from the early 1960s with John F. Kennedy, as before he ran for president, really framing that. And he was really reconnecting to his immigrant roots as part of his presidential and political campaign. But it is, I think, that the identity of the country, we cannot divorce it. We cannot divorce our identity from immigration and from the immigrant experience. And so I do think that in this moment, it's being very much used as a polarizing and divisive narrative. But I also think that unfortunately, it's coming from this place of white nationalist and white Christian nationalist views, which again is a global challenge that we're up against. And which is more reason for us to be coming together and really finding our way out of this period with a story that we get to co-author together about who we want to become as a nation.
So if people have questions, please do drop them into the Q&A box. Um, a lot of the discourse that's so complicated and divisive right now has to do not just with immigration, but with legal immigration. And, you know, you pointed out, it's certainly true that the country has done a very poor job of advancing legislation to address almost every aspect of migration. Um, how do you respond to all this? I mean, there's just swaths of the population that either come in legally under complex temporary statuses, um, which can then be removed, and then there's lots of people here without papers, often for decades. What's the way to narratively construct some more encompassing understanding of migration that genuinely wrestles with the fact that so many people are in the country either without papers or in some sort of temporary or complex status?
Yeah. So I think this question of legality is fundamental. I think it's one of the major misconceptions that we have today. Oftentimes you hear kind of your average person just saying, well, people just don't want to become citizens. They don't want to become Americans. If they really were loyal to the country, they would just go to the post office and get their passport and their social security card. It isn't that easy. We have such a complicated system. There isn't even a line to get into anymore. This is one of those complex societal and global issues that Congress has failed on us completely. I feel like it's Exhibit A to the dysfunction of Congress. And it's not dysfunctional only on immigration. I mean, frankly, they haven't been able to come together to address the fundamental policy challenges of the country, whether it's climate, gun safety, healthcare, you name it. They have been able to come together to cut taxes for billionaires, right? And that you see the political will that we saw last year with the legislation that Trump put forward. And so, where there's a will, a political will, we've seen the ability of Congress to act. But for the most part, on immigration, both parties have failed, fundamentally failed, and failed taxpayers, failed the country. And so I think again, the fact that that Congress has not reformed its immigration laws since 1986, right? I was in high school, 40 years. The world has changed substantially, and so the construction of what is legal or not doesn't really work when people are trying to become legal, but the laws have not allowed for it. On the other hand, you have pull factors, right? You have employers, you have the economy pulling people, recruiting people to the United States. Our ag sector would not survive without undocumented immigrants. And everyone knows that, right? These are like the dirty secrets in our economy that undocumented immigrants are the motor of the economy. And yet they're living on the margins. And so when we allow the laws and policies to be this dysfunctional, one could argue they're dysfunctional by design because it's keeping a set of people so marginalized and excluded from participating in democracy, frankly, that that is really where I think the blame lies is in Congress. And again, I blame both parties for that. I think what the other piece of this, though, is that it's important to understand right now, and I would say since 2015, when Trump first ran for office, but we see it especially in the current administration, is legality doesn't matter, right? People with legal status, people who are here with work authorization, are being detained and disappeared or deported, sometimes not even to their home country, but to a third country, people are losing their legal status. It's being taken away from them. And so it doesn't really matter now, even if you're a permanent resident, even if you're a naturalized citizen like myself for the first time, feeling concerned about whether I'm able to travel safely or not. The majority of calls that I get these days, Daniel, are not just only from undocumented immigrants, it's with people with green cards and naturalized citizens, or people who are wanting to become citizens who are afraid of whether they still belong in this country and whether they are safe or not.
Is there any path forward, do you think, to sort of greater legal management of these situations? So greater clarity for those people whose status should be clear, whether they're green card holders or whether they're naturalized citizens, and to say nothing of the, millions of people who have a variety of different statuses. They're awaiting decisions on their asylum claims, living without any papers, they're here on temporary protected status. But is there any way forward on this national discourse if we don't have greater legal resolution of people's, ability to be in the country and the clarity about that?
So I would say a couple of things. I think the short term, it's the midterm elections are around the corner. We need a House of Representatives, if not both House and Senate, but especially at least the House, to have oversight and to slow down the harm that's happening and to hold elected officials and policymakers accountable for the human rights violations that are happening, right? For the murders of U.S. citizens in Minneapolis, the kidnapping of people, and the wrongful detention of even U.S. citizens. And so I think that in the short term, the path forward is we have to come together to elect policymakers that are going to respect the rule of law, that are going to respect judges' decisions, that are going to follow the law, that are going to ensure that there's due process. These are fundamental tenets of our Constitution and of a healthy democracy. And so first and foremost, I would say that in the short term, part of the path forward has to be that there is a Congress and elected officials that we as taxpayers are holding accountable to do their job. And my one of the hopes that I have is that because things have gotten so out of control right now and the level of crisis and chaos that has been created by the Department of Homeland Security, which has only been in existence for 12 years, right? Since 2003, not 12 years, but um, that, it was after 9/11 that the Department of Homeland Security was created. And, we can right that ship. That entire department has to be reformed and get us onto a place again where the agencies are respecting if somebody has whether it's temporary or permanent residence in the United States, that should be protected and that should be honored. And then there needs to be legislation that actually finally recognizes immigrants who are long-term residents of this country. So I think in particular, Daniel, the majority of undocumented immigrants in the country have been here for more than 10 years. Two-thirds have been here for 10, 15, 20, 25 years. Many are married to U.S. citizens, have U.S. citizen children. They have to be able to get on a path to citizenship. And so I do think that there are opportunities, legislative opportunities over the next years where we may not be able to get a broad legalization. I think for far too long, the immigrant rights movement, including myself and the National Immigration Law Center, we fought for the 11 million, right? Trying to get this large overhaul of the entire system. I think in the short term, that's not possible. And so we have to be able to ensure that if there are political opportunities, legislative windows that open up for dreamers, for example, people with DACA to finally get on a path to citizenship, for the resilience workers that are rebuilding communities after climate disasters, the care workers that are helping to take care of our children and our loved ones who are ill, the farm workers. I mean, talk about security. We have food security in this country because of the farm workers. Like all of those different parts of our society should absolutely be getting on a path to citizenship. And we, as taxpayers and voters, need to hold Congress accountable to make those changes over time.
A question here from Brooks Hilliard. I'm aware of an initiative bringing together a group of major DC-based think tanks and lobbying groups that have been meeting quarterly. They recently agreed that undocumented residents who've been in the US for 10 years or more with no criminal records should be eligible for legal residency. So the point you were making. Do you think that this could be passed by Congress? Uh, and you know, if so, maybe not only could it theoretically, but is what would be a path to advance something like that that might actually not be as divisive as some people, as some other categories of individuals, say those who've come here under temporary protected status in relationship to a particular event that may have passed. Here you have people who've been here a long time, they're establishing communities. Is this strategically a way to move forward? Is this possible? Maybe even will it happen? And if so, what timeline?
Yes, so I completely agree. As you know, as I share some examples of some of those other long-term residents that should get on a path to citizenship, I'm finding through the work, for example, one of the organizations that I work very closely with right now is American Families United, which are the U.S. citizen spouses of undocumented spouses who have not been able, who are afraid of coming forward because their families will be separated due to rules from the 1996 law. So the AFU, the American Families United Act, the Dignity Act, there are a number of pieces of legislation out there that would try to address this. Again, I think we're going to need changes in Congress first. The current Congress, both the Republican controlled Senate and House, unfortunately are showing to be so loyal to the current administration and particularly to Stephen Miller's worldview that I don't see any possible change in the next with the current Congress. However, if there are changes with the midterm elections and in 28 and beyond, I do think that we'll be able to get smaller pieces of legislation like something that provides a path to citizenship for long-term residents of the United States.
You've mentioned that your book deals with a series of different waves of nativist anti-immigrant sentiments that have been a key part of U.S. history, including those that led to very restrictive immigration legislation, and then sometimes the removal of the shift in policy to more open-ended immigration. So, what is it that undermined these nativist narratives in the past? And are there any lessons from that process for the current situation we're in?
So I think that one of the, again, going back to the 1924 period, because that's the most similar to this one, particularly with both the kind of white supremacist and nationalist views and the restrictions that were put in place in 1924. So from 1924 to 1965, what's interesting about that 4 decade period is groups were fighting for their own communities. So you had Italian Americans fighting for Italians, for family reunification. You had Irish also doing the same thing. You had the Jewish community trying to fight for humanitarian relief, which prior to the World War II, there weren't any humanitarian reliefs, or refugee wasn't even a category. So as groups were dispersed and each fighting for their own communities, they were not successful. It was only when groups really started coming together and got aligned on a core strategy going forward. And then what really created the conditions, the political conditions, was the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement was fundamental in helping to clarify and crystallize that in the United States, and the United States could not be a beacon of hope or a global diplomatic leader talking about democracy if there was so much racism and discrimination in so many parts of our society, including in the immigration laws. And so I think it's the combination of groups of immigrants, different communities impacted by the immigration laws coming together to fight for a core strategy, but also the intersection with other communities. And I think right now, when we're experiencing a backlash, not just on immigration and immigrants, but on civil rights, on the rights of workers, on gender equality, right? On all of these areas of law and policy where we've been making a lot of progress and there have been victories. And so it's because the LGBTQ community has fought for and won so many rights, particularly with the trans community, that they are now being under attack. We're seeing that with gender and gender equality and the right of choice. Um, and so having all of those sectors of society come together again to fight for all of us for a better country that is more inclusive, and where we have a healthy democracy for all becomes really critical.
Do you think there's a chance of a sort of a darker future, which is to say, you look at like agricultural workers, there's been a substantial increase in temporary work visas, H-2A program, that's been growing quite significantly. And one could imagine that the labor side of migration will be picked up by labor brokers and new rules and expansions of temporary worker programs. That is to say, people can come legally, work, and then have to return to their homes when the work is done. That's been a common policy in lots of parts of the world in less integrated pro-immigrant societies. Is that a significant possibility in the future for the labor side of migration?
Absolutely. And I wouldn't even say too far into the future. I think that's one of the things we're hearing right now from the Republican controlled Senate and House and the Trump administration, which is one of the ways to address the issue, especially as agricultural employers. The ag industry raises concerns about how the current immigration detention and deportation is impacting their workforce. One of the solutions that's being put out there is, okay, well, let's expand the H-2A program, for example, for farm workers. And that by itself is not the solution. Again, for the farm workers that are here, along with other long-term resident undocumented immigrants, they should be put on a path to citizenship so that employers who've invested in those workers are able to have those workers continue in those jobs and move forward as well. I think the other piece that we also need to take a look at is any of these programs that are temporary programs, H-2A, H-2B, H-1B, right, for higher skilled workers, those all need to be reformed in the sense that there has to be visa portability, right? We cannot have or can no longer continue to have workers that are tied to those employers, who are then subject to greater exploitation because of that. Similarly, we need to make sure that there's circular migration. Not every worker wants to come to the United States indefinitely and become a citizen. Many workers do want to come here simply to earn money and go back home. And so we need to make sure that that circular migration comes with full labor and civil rights so that those workers are protected, but also to make sure that these systems are not actually depressing working conditions and wages for US born workers and other documented immigrant workers as well.
Yeah. So we're coming up to the 250th anniversary of the U.S. and there'll be all sorts of celebrations. Um, is there a way, do you think, that there can be some unifying national narrative that maybe builds on history and projects some sort of vision of American identity that views immigration um, more positively than the moment we're in right now in the tense and kind of divisive nature of the debate?
Absolutely. I think that that is the homework that we all have, right? This is a rare national moment of reflection. There are few opportunities that we have to revisit foundational narratives. And I think there's an opportunity to move away from seeing immigration as a wedge that divides us, and one that actually allows us to weave our shared histories and our shared futures. And there are many opportunities, and many conversations happening about how do we use this moment to really reunite, and to forge a different path forward that really does recognize, as you were saying earlier, our immigrant history and this framing of the United States as a nation where immigrants and immigration are core to the DNA and to who we are. And so I do think that we have an opportunity, I would say almost an obligation, a moral obligation in this moment to redefine belonging as being a democratic value and to ensure that immigrants and immigration are part of that discussion of what it means to belong in this country. And I continue coming back to this notion of the Project of Us, right? That this is really about all of us, and that all means all, and all means including people who may not want my family to exist here, and that I need to be willing to include them in the conversations about how do we shape the future of our country as well. But the 250th anniversary isn't only about looking back in history, it really is an invitation for us to decide who we are becoming, who America is becoming.
What if all Americans did what your book is about and traced their own family histories? I don't think there's too many families that wouldn't have immigration, even in the relatively recent past.
That's part of my hope. My hope is that the book will help spur national conversations where people will go back to learn about their own immigrant histories, their families' histories, and to learn not just what, when people came, but why they came and what kind of conditions they found in the United States at the time that they arrived, and what were the immigration laws that shaped their arrival, and were they included at the time that they arrived or not, and what has changed since then. And so I do think that knowing who our ancestors are and being rooted in our identity allows us to be more whole as individual human beings, and that is also what allows us to see our shared humanity.
So we're getting towards the end of our time here. Is there any sort of message that you would like to bring out? I mean, you've done for many, many years, you did concrete legal advocacy that was policy oriented. Um, is there is there some lesson from all of that work that you can bring to bear that's concrete and specific for our country?
So I think a couple of things that I would say, Daniel. One is that, as we've been talking about, right, that immigration is not separate from democracy, that it really is one of the clearest tests of a healthy democracy. And so it's important that we look at what's at stake. It's not just policy outcomes. For far too long, both the immigration advocate community, like myself, we're looking at policy solutions, but this is really ultimately about belonging. It really ultimately is about how we rethink immigration as a space of possibility, how we can come together for a collective effort to reimagine belonging, to move from allowing immigration to be used as from a fear mongering and divisive place to instead imagining our future together, and particularly at a time that migration is not a problem that will ever go away. It's a global phenomenon that exists in all beings, right? Birds migrate, dolphins, whales migrate, etc. Human beings will always continue migrating as well, and we will only see increased migration in the world. I mean, right now with the war in the Middle East and Iran and other places where people are being displaced, that is causing migration. And so at the core, I would say that part of it is we really do need to look at what I often refer to is, if you're concerned about immigration, we need to look at the freedom to stay, for people to be able to stay in their homeland, to live in countries, in communities where they have the ability to have clean water and educational and economic opportunities, where they don't feel forced to leave, where there are responses to climate change, and that if people are coming to the United States and they choose to come, that we have legal and humanitarian ways for people to do so safely, and that immigration story of who we've been is also the story that will shape who we become as a nation.
Marielena, thank you so much, and thanks everybody for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Daniel.